Okay, welcome back everybody, and here we are at the start of our next topic. This is going to be World War II. As you can probably imagine, this is going to be a pretty big one, and so we actually have 4 different recordings to get through in order to hit all of the essential parts of the war. But even with that, there's unfortunately going to be stuff that we will be leaving out, or I don't want to say glossing over, but sort of touching on and moving on from there. This is a topic that can and oftentimes is covered all by itself as an entire class. And so obviously there's no way we're going to be able to go into great detail about it, as we're working through basically a week and a half worth of our course. But if you've got questions about anything, make sure that you let me know. Make sure that you're reviewing the full PowerPoints on Blackboard so that you get all the content that's available on there as well. So I hope everyone is doing really, really well. And without further ado, we can go ahead and get started with the Second World War. So much like the beginning of World War I, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is the United States is not interested in getting involved in the war at the outset, right? So the war begins in Europe in September of 1939 when Germany invades Poland. And some historians will point to the start of World War I, or World War II rather, as being connected with Japan's aggression against China in 1931 and 1936 when they invade Manchuria and then when they invade China proper. But, we'll kind of just ignore those debates and those conversations because we don't really have time to get into them. But by and large, the American public is not interested in participating in the war on either front. Franklin Roosevelt, who is president at the time, is not enthusiastic about getting into the war, but recognizes that Hitler in particular represents a dire threat to world stability and world peace and world safety, and potentially, if left unchecked, potentially he's a threat to the United States as well. And so Roosevelt believes that America will need to get involved in the war to aid Great Britain. And we'll talk about some of the sort of dynamics of that as we get through the next, several recordings. But the difficulty that Roosevelt faces is he does not have a great deal of support among the general public, and he doesn't have really much support in Congress either. And so even though he wants to try to provide assistance in whatever way he can, he's not really able to do a whole lot because he meets a lot of resistance from virtually all of the groups that he had been able to rely on during his administration as it dealt with the Great Depression. So one of the public groups that is really active in sort of resisting the idea of America going to war is called the America First Committee. And the America First Committee basically organizes demonstrations and speeches and letter writing campaigns and these sorts of things to try to encourage Americans to speak out in opposition to joining the war. And probably the most notable figure, and it's sort of the honorary spokesperson, I guess, for the America First Committee, is Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh, you may know, is famous historically for being the first person to fly nonstop solo across the Atlantic Ocean, which, when he did it in 1927, was a monumental achievement, really. And so he lends a lot of weight to the idea of isolation. There are a handful of people who do try to encourage assistance for the Allied powers, but by and large, they're on the outside looking in. And so Roosevelt is really faced with the challenge of figuring out how he can provide aid without putting the United States on a path to war, but also provide aid without sort of rubbing Congress the wrong way. And so one of the first things that he's able to sort of maneuver through Congress is what's called the Destroyers for Bases deal. And basically this was in response to England's desperate calls for aid to help them protect the convoys that were sailing across the Atlantic to deliver really essential material and food and equipment and war-making machinery and ammunition and so on. And basically the Destroyers for Bases deals centered around giving Great Britain 50 destroyers, sort of small, fairly, in this case, outdated warships from the US Navy, so that they could use those ships to help secure their convoys, secure their merchant fleets. In exchange, the United States would get 99-year leases on naval bases sort of at the edges of American territory. So bases in the Caribbean, bases around the coast of Canada. And Roosevelt is able to spin this by saying, well, these destroyers were not frontline ships. They weren't going to be part of the overall naval plan going forward. They were outdated. We were probably just going to destroy them. We get something in exchange. We can aid Britain in its attempts to keep fighting the war without getting directly involved, and we're giving ourselves additional protection around the edges of territory that we can sort of secure our borders more effectively against the possibility of a German attack. So it's a really clever way of ticking a lot of boxes that manage to sort of satisfy or at least placate congressmen who are not interested in pushing closer to war. Kind of by the same token, in the spring of 1941, Congress passes what's called the Lend-Lease Act. Basically, this is giving money to the Allies, especially Great Britain and France. And in exchange, the expectation was that the Allied powers would buy materials from American manufacturers, so it would end up helping the American economy in the long run as well. So these are ways that Roosevelt manages to provide assistance to Great Britain in particular, and the reason that he can't provide assistance to France in this case is because in June of 1940, the French surrender. And so he can't really provide aid in the direct way that he would have liked, right? So the aid from Lend-Lease, I know it says France, that goes to what's called the Free French, which is the French resistance effort. And so it's not the official French government at that point. And so here's sort of the map laying out where the different bases that the Americans got access to in the Destroyers for Bases deal. And you can see the coast of the United States is more protected now, and then also the U.S. can use the bases in the Caribbean to help protect its possessions like Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands. Also, the U.S. can use those possessions to protect the Panama Canal, which was an essential kind of strategic location that the Americans and the British and the Chinese were all really sort of concerned about. So it's a way in both cases for the United States to provide financial or material assistance to Britain and the Allies without necessarily getting drawn into the war itself. Over time, though, Roosevelt is more and more hopeful that some kind of a situation will arise that will allow him to bring the United States more fully into the war. Again, he is not a warmonger. He's not hoping to participate in what will be the most devastating conflict in all of history. But he realizes that the United States has the capacity to shorten the war and ideally have the result be a favorable one for democracy and against fascism and things like that. So the thing that actually gets the United States into the war is not anything to do with Germany or Hitler or Italy and Mussolini. It is with Japan. And how does that all happen? Well, Japan during the 1920s is coming increasingly under the control of a very sort of fanatically nationalistic military. And so the Japanese believe that they've been treated as sort of second-class powers by other major players in the world, by the United States, by Britain in particular. And the Japanese want to sort of demonstrate that they deserve to be part of the global scene as more equal participants. And one of the things that they recognize to be kind of essential in that process is acquiring territory outside of Japan itself. Because Japan doesn't have a lot of natural resources of their own. So if you want to become a superpower, what the equivalent of a superpower pre-1945, you need to have access to those natural resources, whether it's oil or rubber or iron or coal, the kinds of things that are going to really power a military machine, but also that will power an economy more generally speaking. And so they invade Manchuria, which is the northeastern part of China. They do that in 1931, and eventually in 1936 they push deeper into China proper. They expand their control over big parts of China through 1937, 8, and 9. By about 1940 and into 41, they start to invade other parts of Southeast Asia, places like what's called Indochina at the time. Today it's Vietnam and Laos and places like that. And they invade the Dutch colony that will become Indonesia. At the time it's called the Dutch East Indies. And the United States is watching all of this kind of nervously because Japan has already been demonstrating that they are fairly aggressive, but also fairly advanced technologically, especially compared to their neighbors. And so the US is a little worried that Japan is a rising power in the East and threatens the United States in its attempts to kind of influence Asian policy. And the United States has possessions in Guam and in the Philippines that they worry the Japanese might end up threatening directly. And from the Japanese perspective, they say it's pretty obvious that at a certain point, Japan and the United States will end up going to war over Japan's aggression in Asia. The Japanese say to themselves, what we need to do is we need to strike early, a preemptive strike, basically, that will knock the United States out completely, or at the very least, will knock them to the ground for long enough that Japan will be able to secure its borders, secure its access to these natural resources, and be able to use those natural resources to build its military capacity to the point where they wouldn't have to worry about the United States down the road. American military intelligence assumes that the most likely place for Japan to attack would be the Philippines, or potentially Guam. Virtually nobody imagines that the Japanese will attack all the way across the Pacific to Hawaii at the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. And that's actually where the Japanese do attack. So it is a complete surprise, not because the Americans weren't anticipating a Japanese attack someplace, but because the Americans didn't expect that the Japanese would attack that particular location. And they do, right? The morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, three waves of Japanese fighters and torpedo planes and dive bombers attack the Pacific Fleet at anchor at Pearl Harbor and inflict a pretty sizable defeat on the American fleet. It's a complete surprise. And in the process, they destroy or damage every single battleship that the Americans have in the Pacific Ocean. They kill over 2,400 sailors, airmen, Marines, soldiers, because this is a military complex, right? It's a naval base, but it has air bases near it, it has an army base near it, and so on. So this is a pretty devastating attack. The Japanese imagine that this will be not necessarily the death blow to the United States, but they imagine that this will shock and dismay the American public to the point where they will not have sort of the enthusiasm or the appetite for a war. And they kind of underestimate the capacity for the United States to recover from this economically, militarily, psychologically, and so on. Pearl Harbor, though, is not the only thing that is happening in early December 1941. This is part of a larger coordinated series of attacks that include attacks in Southeast Asia, include attacks on Guam, on the Philippines, and places that are either American or British strongpoints in Southeast Asia. And so it is a kind of large-scale effort by the Japanese to wipe out or at least severely hamper and handicap the naval capacities of their main enemies, being the United States and Britain. This is a pretty poor miscalculation, though, because the attack on Pearl Harbor initially can be viewed as a success for the Japanese, right? It kills or injures thousands and thousands of American servicemen and women. It destroys or severely damages a big chunk of the Pacific Fleet. So it seems as though it's going to be a success, right? Be considered a victory. But beyond the immediate moment of the attack on Pearl Harbor, it is not a victory. It's a failure in a number of different ways, right? Tactically speaking, it doesn't destroy or damage any of the aircraft carriers that would ultimately prove to be the most essential weapon that both navies have in the Pacific War. Those aircraft carriers were out on maneuvers and were nowhere near the harbor in Hawaii at the time. In addition, the Japanese didn't destroy any of the infrastructure of Pearl Harbor. So the dry docks, which are big concrete structures where damaged boats and ships can be repaired, those were left intact, which means that, yes, lots of damage was done to the fleet, but the infrastructure that would allow the Americans to rebuild and repair was still left intact. If they had destroyed those dry docks, then the Americans would have had to find other solutions, right? Either try to tow the damaged ships all the way to California, or take time to rebuild the dry docks and then use those newly reconstructed dry docks in order to build or repair the ships that were damaged and destroyed. So it is a great time saver from the American perspective that those weren't touched. The oil refineries and oil storage facilities around Pearl Harbor weren't touched, which means that you have all of the fuel necessary to power the American response much more quickly than it would have been available if the Japanese had destroyed those. So the Japanese sort of fail in that respect. Strategically speaking, the United States would have had the same kind of, well, how to put this? So strategically speaking, the Japanese did not need to attack Pearl Harbor in order to dislodge the Americans from places like the Philippines or other parts of Southeast Asia. So they could easily have secured the territory that they wanted to in Southeast Asia through other means without necessarily having to attack Pearl Harbor to do it. Psychologically speaking, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor mobilizes the Americans in a way that would be virtually impossible in any other situation. So Americans are so outraged at the attack on Pearl Harbor that there's no question that they will want to wage war against Japan. And so that's exactly what happens, right? The Japanese have this kind of misconception that the Americans will be so shocked and dismayed by the defeat at Pearl Harbor that it will take them a while to kind of get the taste to actually go to war. In reality, it's just the opposite, right? This motivates millions of Americans to volunteer. It causes Congress to pass a declaration of war the next day, virtually unanimously. I think there were 2 people who voted against the war. And so it also contributes to American attitudes in the Pacific War that were in some ways much more racist and much more brutal than what you see going on in Europe. Not to say that either theater of the war was really pleasant or enjoyable, but stories and accounts of men who served in the Pacific compared to men who served in Europe, they really do point out a significant difference in attitudes and behaviors and treatment of the enemy in a lot of ways. So the war then begins for the United States as a result of Japan's attack in December of 1941. But it is also then going to, as we will see, cause potentially a significant problem because Roosevelt was anticipating that the United States would have to get involved in Europe. But the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor doesn't give the United States a cause to go to war in Europe yet. And so, for a little while at least, Roosevelt is concerned that he may not have the opportunity to wage war against from what he sees, the biggest threat, which is Hitler and Nazi Germany. So how does that happen? How does the war progress in the first few years? That's going to be the subject of our next recording. So again, be sure that you're looking over all of the PowerPoints on Blackboard, and be sure that you're getting in touch with me anytime you've got questions about anything so that I can point you in the right direction there. So I hope everyone's doing well. Our next recording, as I said, will talk about the war itself, how it progressed and that kind of thing, especially in Europe. And so I will see everybody soon.